I always believed fake authority was loud because it had to be. Real authority never needed to shout. The first thing I noticed that morning wasn't the heavy chain wrapped around my vineyard gate. It was the silence. Usually, sunrise carried the soft rustle of grape leaves drifting across the rows, the distant hum of irrigation pumps waking up for another summer day, and the familiar chatter of meadowlarks perched along the cedar fence. Instead, I heard a sharp metallic clink as someone tightened a padlock that didn't belong there. The smell of damp soil mixed with fresh-cut grass lingered in the cool California air, while the first rays of sunlight painted my vines in gold. But something about the scene felt completely wrong. Two white SUVs sat across my gravel entrance with magnetic decals reading HOA patrol. A pair of men wearing matching navy polos stood beside the gate with clipboards tucked under their arms like they owned the place. One of them hammered a bright orange violation notice onto my wooden fence, while the other calmly photographed every angle of my property. Neither one looked surprised when my pickup rolled to a stop. In fact, they smiled. That smile told me everything I needed to know. They thought they had already won. I climbed out, boots crunching against the gravel my father had spread himself almost 30 years earlier, and looked at the chain before I looked at either of them. The lock was brand new. The steel still smelled faintly of machine oil. One of the men cleared his throat before speaking in the practiced voice of someone who enjoyed repeating rules to strangers. "Sir, this property has been placed under HOA enforcement pending compliance review." I glanced from his badge to the paper hanging on my fence. My vineyard. My gate. My family name carved into the weathered oak sign just a few feet behind them. Yet somehow they were acting as if I needed permission to enter. "Interesting," I said quietly. "Which HOA would that be?" He answered without hesitation. "Silver Creek Estates Homeowners Association." I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I slipped my truck keys back into my pocket and simply nodded. The second man pointed toward the notice and explained that unauthorized agricultural operations, commercial traffic, equipment storage, and landscaping violations had resulted in immediate restrictions. Every sentence sounded more rehearsed than the last. Every word carried the confidence of someone who had never bothered to check a property map. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. I didn't tell them they had chained the entrance to a vineyard that had existed decades before Silver Creek Estates ever poured its first sidewalk. I didn't mention that my grandfather planted the original vines long before anyone dreamed of building luxury homes on the neighboring hillsides. I didn't explain that every acre behind that gate belonged to my family through a deed older than most of the subdivision residents. Instead, I reached into my shirt pocket, tapped the record button on my phone, and let them keep talking. Sometimes the most expensive mistake a person can make isn't trespassing. It's explaining they're trespassing on camera. They thought they were enforcing neighborhood rules. They had no idea they were standing outside their jurisdiction, locking the gate to property their HOA had never controlled for a single day. My name is Ethan Walker, and everything behind that locked gate carried my family's fingerprints. My grandfather bought the first 20 acres in 1968 after returning from military service with little more than a pickup truck, a box of worn tools, and a promise to my grandmother that someday they would build something worth passing down. People laughed when he planted grapes instead of almonds because they said the rocky hillside would never produce anything valuable. He smiled, kept digging, and let the seasons prove them wrong. My father expanded the vineyard one careful row at a time, never borrowing more money than he could repay and never sacrificing quality for speed. I grew up measuring summers by harvests instead of school vacations. The smell of crushed grapes, diesel tractors, and fresh oak barrels felt more familiar than any cologne ever could. Every fence post had a story. Every irrigation valve had been repaired by someone in my family at least once. Even the old gravel road leading to the gate carried tire tracks from 3 generations of harvest trucks. After my father passed away, I inherited more than land. I inherited responsibility. I modernized the irrigation system, upgraded the winery equipment, and signed supply contracts with restaurants from Napa to Sacramento, but I refused to change the character of the place. Visitors often asked why I had never sold to one of the luxury developers buying everything around us. The answer was always simple. You cannot sell memories that belong to people who are gone. Over the last 15 years, expensive homes slowly surrounded the vineyard. Vineyards became views instead of livelihoods. Families who once waved from pickup trucks were replaced by people walking tiny designer dogs while discussing property values over imported coffee. Then came Silver Creek Estates, a gated subdivision with stone monuments at the entrance, perfectly trimmed hedges, and an association that seemed convinced every inch of the valley should eventually answer to its rulebook. They held neighborhood festivals, published glossy newsletters, and proudly described themselves as the gold standard of community living. None of that bothered me because my mailbox stood outside their entrance, my taxes went to the county, and my deed had never included a single page mentioning a homeowners association. We were neighbors, nothing more. Every survey map, every county assessment, and every title report said exactly the same thing. My vineyard was independent private property. That was not an opinion. It was recorded history. I had crossed paths with a few board members over the years at local business events, and they always treated the vineyard like an attractive backdrop for their subdivision brochures. One woman in particular, Linda Harper, never hid her interest. She carried herself with polished confidence, drove a pearl-white sport utility vehicle that always looked freshly detailed, and spoke with the calm certainty of someone accustomed to hearing yes. During one Chamber of Commerce dinner, she looked across my vineyard and smiled before saying, "A property like yours would fit beautifully into our community vision someday." I smiled back and answered just as politely, "It already fits perfectly into mine." She laughed as though I had made a harmless joke, but her eyes lingered on the vineyard longer than they did on the conversation. Standing outside my chained gate that morning, watching those orange notices flutter against my fence in the breeze, I suddenly remembered that smile. Looking back now, I realized she had never admired the vineyard. She had been measuring it. The two men eventually climbed back into their sport utility vehicle without removing the chain. Before leaving, one of them slipped a laminated card into the notice sleeve and pointed toward a printed email address if I wished to appeal the enforcement action. Then they drove away slowly, as though they expected me to admire their professionalism. Dust settled across the gravel road while I stood there listening to the quiet return. The irrigation pumps continued humming behind the locked gate. My vineyard had survived droughts, wildfires, late frosts, and collapsing markets. Now it was apparently being threatened by paperwork from people who had never planted a single vine. I reached into my truck, pulled out a pair of binoculars, and watched the white vehicle disappear towards Silver Creek Estates. Instead of heading to the main office, it stopped outside the largest house in the subdivision. A woman stepped onto the circular driveway before the engine even shut off. Even from several hundred yards away, I recognized Linda Harper immediately. Her cream-colored blazer looked perfectly pressed despite the warm morning sun, and she carried a leather portfolio tucked against her side like a trophy. The two patrol men handed her their clipboards, and all three spent several minutes reviewing photographs taken from my property. Linda nodded with obvious satisfaction before pointing back toward my vineyard. She was not reacting to a complaint. She was directing the operation. That afternoon, I drove into town for supplies, and as luck would have it, I stopped at the same local coffee shop where half the county eventually wandered in. While waiting for my order, I overheard two contractors discussing a proposed expansion near Silver Creek Estates. One of them mentioned a future wine trail, boutique hotel, event center, and luxury tasting experience designed to increase surrounding home values. Another laughed and asked where they planned to build it because every available parcel had already been developed. The answer came with a quiet chuckle. Not every parcel. They are still trying to figure out that old vineyard. I never turned around. I simply stirred my coffee and listened. According to their conversation, Linda had spent months pitching county officials on a long-term community vision that would transform the entire hillside into one unified destination. There was only one obstacle. My property sat directly between the subdivision and the scenic overlook they wanted visitors to reach. Without my land, the project remained fragmented. With it, the development would become seamless. Suddenly, every strange interaction from the past few years fit together like pieces of a survey map. Invitations to join neighborhood meetings. Friendly suggestions about shared maintenance agreements. Questions about access easements. Casual conversations about future planning. None of them had been casual at all. They had been measuring resistance. I drove back to the vineyard before sunset. The chain still hung across my entrance, catching the last orange light of the day. The violation notice fluttered gently against the fence while the scent of ripening grapes drifted through the cooling evening air. Linda had not chosen my vineyard because it violated some neighborhood standard. She had chosen it because it stood exactly where her master plan needed an empty space, and she believed enough pressure, enough official-looking paperwork, and enough fake confidence would eventually convince me to surrender what 3 generations of my family had spent a lifetime protecting. The pressure started the very next morning, and it arrived with the kind of polite confidence that only people hiding behind paperwork seem to master. Before sunrise, I found another envelope clipped to the chain across my entrance. The paper was thick, professionally printed, and carried the Silver Creek Estates logo across the top. According to the letter, my vineyard had accumulated multiple community violations in less than 24 hours. Unauthorized commercial vehicle access, improper agricultural activity, excessive equipment visibility, landscaping inconsistent with neighborhood standards. A daily fine schedule followed beneath each accusation, adding up to an amount that would make most small family businesses nervous. I folded the notice carefully instead of crumpling it. Angry people destroy evidence. Patient people collect it. By 8 o'clock, the first delivery truck carrying empty wine barrels arrived. The driver climbed out, scratched his head at the locked gate, and asked if the road was closed. Before I could answer, another white sport utility vehicle rolled up with the same magnetic HOA patrol decals. One of the men stepped out and calmly informed the driver that commercial deliveries were temporarily suspended pending compliance review. The driver looked at me with confusion written across his face. I simply thanked him for coming and promised I would reschedule once the situation was resolved. He drove away, leaving behind nothing but the fading smell of diesel and another missed business opportunity. Around lunchtime, my phone started ringing. First came a distributor asking why his shipment had been delayed. Then a wedding planner called because someone claiming to represent the Homeowners Association had informed her that my vineyard might not be available for scheduled events due to ongoing enforcement actions. By early afternoon, 2 seasonal workers texted me asking whether they should report to work because they had heard the property was under investigation. Rumors were spreading faster than facts. That was exactly what Linda wanted. She did not need to win in court if she could convince enough people that my business had become too complicated to trust. Late that afternoon, I watched from a distance as Linda herself arrived at the gate. She never stepped onto my property. Instead, she stood just outside the fence speaking with a landscaping contractor while occasionally pointing toward different sections of the vineyard. Every gesture looked deliberate, as though she were already planning improvements for land she did not own. When the contractor finally drove away, she noticed me standing near the opposite side of the fence. Her smile never wavered. "You know, Ethan," she said in that calm, practiced voice, "these situations become much easier when everyone cooperates." I asked only one question. "Cooperates with what?" She rested one hand lightly against the wooden post beside the notice. "Community standards. Progress. There is always a reasonable solution." I nodded slowly, thanked her for the advice, and watched her leave. She probably mistook my calm expression for uncertainty. The truth was much simpler. Every phone call, every letter, every delayed delivery, every conversation, and every visit was creating a timeline. My security cameras recorded the vehicles. My phone logged every interruption. My business records documented every cancellation. They believed pressure would eventually force me into negotiation. They never considered that every additional step they took was quietly strengthening a case they did not even realize they were building against themselves. By the end of the week, I had stopped reacting altogether, and that seemed to frustrate Linda more than any argument ever could. She wanted confrontation. She wanted raised voices, emotional emails, and angry phone calls she could point to as proof that I was being unreasonable. Instead, every morning began the same way. I brewed a pot of black coffee, walked to the locked gate with the cool morning air carrying the scent of ripe grapes and damp earth, and quietly photographed whatever new document had appeared overnight. I stored every image in dated folders. Every voicemail went into a separate archive. Every email received a digital backup. I even kept the envelopes because postmarks tell stories that people often forget. My cameras captured every vehicle that stopped at the entrance. Motion alerts quietly filled my phone throughout the day as HOA patrol trucks returned again and again to inspect property they had no legal authority to inspect. I never deleted a single clip. I purchased additional cloud storage instead. My attorney had once given me a piece of advice during an unrelated contract dispute. He smiled and said, "The calmest person usually owns the strongest evidence." Those words echoed in my head every time another notice appeared on my fence. Linda, meanwhile, seemed convinced that increasing the pressure would eventually produce panic. She scheduled what she called a compliance meeting and mailed me an invitation that described attendance as mandatory. I did not respond because mandatory only applies when someone actually has jurisdiction. 2 days later, another letter arrived informing me that my absence had been recorded as non-cooperation. I added it to the growing folder without writing a single word back. Around the same time, one of my neighboring ranchers drove over in his aging pickup after hearing rumors around town. He leaned against the fence, looked at the chain still hanging across my entrance, and asked why I had not simply cut it off. I smiled and shook my head. Because it belongs to them. He laughed at first, then realized I was serious. If I remove it, I explained, the evidence disappears. If they leave it there, it keeps proving exactly what they did. His grin slowly turned into an approving nod. Before leaving, he looked back at the gate one more time and said, "That is a level of patience I do not think I have." The following afternoon, I noticed something even more interesting. A small drone lifted off from somewhere inside Silver Creek Estates and drifted toward my vineyard, hovering over the rows before circling the entrance. It remained just long enough to capture photographs before flying back toward the subdivision. My own security system recorded the entire flight path from multiple angles, including the exact direction from which it arrived and where it disappeared. I quietly downloaded the footage and labeled the file before returning to work. Every move they made carried the same flaw. They believed confidence could replace legal authority. They believed uniforms, printed notices, and official language would eventually rewrite property lines that had existed for decades. They mistook silence for surrender. What they never understood was that I had already stopped thinking like a property owner defending land. I was thinking like someone assembling a timeline, one document, one recording, one photograph, and one unnecessary decision at a time, waiting for the moment when every carefully collected piece would fit together so perfectly that no explanation in the world could pull it apart. The breakthrough arrived on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, hidden inside a dusty records room that smelled of old paper, polished wood, and aging blueprints. I had driven to the county planning office with nothing more than a notebook and a list of parcel numbers my father used to keep taped inside an old filing cabinet. The clerk behind the counter recognized our family name immediately and disappeared into the archive without asking many questions. 20 minutes later, she returned, pushing a small cart stacked with survey maps, subdivision plats, easement records, and documents that had not been touched in decades. The paper felt brittle beneath my fingertips as I carefully unfolded the oldest survey. Black ink lines stretched across the page with remarkable precision despite being more than 40 years old. My grandfather's vineyard appeared exactly where it still stood today. Then I found the document that changed everything. It was the original subdivision plat for Silver Creek Estates, approved years after my family had already been farming the hillside. A thick red boundary line marked the official limits of the Homeowners Association. I traced it slowly with my finger until I reached the northern edge. The line stopped several feet short of my fence. Not inches, not an unclear corner. Several unmistakable feet. The vineyard had never been included. It had never been annexed. No amendment existed. No recorded covenant crossed onto my land. Every notice taped to my fence, every fine they issued, every inspection they conducted, every chain they locked across my entrance had been directed at property completely outside their jurisdiction. I asked the clerk whether any later amendments had expanded the Homeowners Association boundary. She searched the digital database, then checked another archive before shaking her head with complete certainty. "Nothing has ever changed this line," she said. "Your parcel has always remained independent." Those words echoed louder than any courtroom verdict I could imagine. I requested certified copies of every relevant record, including the original surveys, county geographic information system maps, title history, and subdivision approvals. As the printer hummed beside the counter, fresh pages slid into the output tray one after another, each carrying an official county seal that no homeowners association could argue with. On my way out, I stopped beside a large wall map displaying every parcel in the county. From that distance, the truth became almost laughably obvious. Silver Creek Estates formed a neat rectangle of residential lots. My vineyard sat beside it like a completely separate island of agricultural land. The two properties shared a view, not a legal relationship. Back at the vineyard, I spread every certified document across the wooden table inside the winery. Late afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the faded survey lines while the sweet aroma of aging wine filled the room. I compared the county maps with every violation notice Linda had mailed me. The addresses matched my property perfectly. The legal authority did not. They had never made a small technical mistake. They had ignored the single fact that determined whether they possessed any authority at all. Looking at the chain still hanging across my entrance outside the window, I finally understood why I had felt no urgency to cut it down. That lock had become far more valuable than the steel it was made from. It was now the first piece of physical evidence in a story that the county's own records had just confirmed beyond any reasonable doubt. The next morning, I finally made the only phone call I had been intentionally delaying. My attorney answered before the second ring, and instead of beginning with frustration, I began with a simple sentence. I think they just handed us everything we need. Less than an hour later, we were sitting around the Old Oak Conference table inside my winery, the same table where my father used to negotiate grape contracts with nothing more than a handshake and a legal pad. This time, the table disappeared beneath carefully organized evidence. Certified county surveys, original subdivision plats, property deeds, security camera screenshots, time-stamped photographs of the chain across my entrance, copies of every violation notice, delivery cancellations, business records showing delayed shipments. Even the drone footage rested on a flash drive beside my coffee cup. My attorney studied everything without speaking for nearly 20 minutes. The only sound came from pages turning and the faint hum of refrigeration units preserving the latest vintage. Finally, he leaned back, folded his hands, and smiled in a way that told me the conversation had shifted completely. "Ethan," he said calmly, "this stopped being an association dispute the moment they stepped outside their legal boundary." By noon, he had drafted a detailed demand letter supported by certified county records and every piece of documentation we had collected. The letter required Silver Creek Estates to remove every restriction immediately, preserve all internal communications related to my property, cease contacting my business partners, and identify every individual who had entered or attempted to exercise authority over land outside the association. Copies went to Linda Harper, the Homeowners Association Board, their legal counsel, the county attorney, and the county sheriff's office. We were no longer arguing about opinions. We were placing official agencies on notice. That afternoon, I received an email from Linda requesting what she called an informal meeting to resolve misunderstandings. It was the first message she had written that contained neither deadlines nor threats. I politely declined through my attorney. Every future conversation would now happen in writing. Late that evening, another white sport utility vehicle approached my entrance. I watched from inside the winery as the driver slowed near the chain, remained parked for nearly a minute, then quietly drove away without adding another notice to my fence. The confidence that had defined every earlier visit seemed to have disappeared overnight. 2 days later, the county sheriff stopped by, not because I was under investigation, but because my attorney had requested documentation of the blocked entrance. The deputy examined the chain, photographed the lock, reviewed the certified survey maps, and compared them against the county geographic information system on his patrol computer. He looked up at me with a puzzled expression before saying, "This parcel is completely outside the Homeowners Association boundary." I nodded. "That is what I have been saying without saying it." He smiled slightly, finished his report, and carefully documented every identifying mark on the lock before leaving. Standing there after his patrol vehicle disappeared down the gravel road, I noticed something I had not seen in days. The vineyard felt peaceful again. The breeze carried the sweet scent of ripening fruit through the rows while sunlight reflected off leaves that had remained untouched by every letter, every rumor, and every empty display of authority. Linda believed official-looking paperwork created power. The county's own records had just reminded everyone that authority begins with jurisdiction, and without it, even the most confident badge is nothing more than polished plastic clipped to an expensive shirt. Everything changed the following Monday, just after sunrise. The same gravel entrance that had been blocked for more than a week suddenly filled with vehicles that were not there to enforce imaginary rules. A county inspector arrived first, followed by a sheriff's deputy, then a representative from the county planning department carrying a thick folder tucked beneath one arm. I stood quietly beside the vineyard gate, while cool morning air carried the scent of ripe Cabernet grapes across the hillside. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. The only sounds came from camera shutters, pins scratching across inspection forms, and the metallic click as the deputy photographed the chain from every possible angle before documenting its serial number. Less than 20 minutes later, another sport utility vehicle rolled to a stop. Linda Harper stepped out wearing the same polished confidence I had seen for years, but this time it lasted only until she noticed who was already standing at the entrance. Her eyes moved from the county inspector to the sheriff's deputy, then finally toward the certified survey maps spread across the hood of the planning department truck. Nobody greeted her with the authority she had become accustomed to. Instead, the county inspector calmly pointed to the original subdivision plat and traced the homeowners association boundary with one finger. Even from several yards away, I could see exactly where his hand stopped, several feet short of my fence. Linda attempted to explain that the association had acted in good faith based on community understanding and long-established neighborhood expectations. The planning official listened politely before responding with a sentence so simple it seemed to empty the entire conversation of emotion. Community expectations do not change recorded property boundaries. Silence settled over the entrance. The breeze gently rustled the vineyard leaves while everyone looked toward the chain still hanging across my gate. The deputy asked one straightforward question. Who authorized this lock? No one answered immediately. After a long pause, Linda quietly admitted the homeowners association had approved temporary enforcement measures while waiting for compliance. The deputy made another note in his report without changing his expression. By late afternoon, the chain disappeared. One of the same patrol employees who had installed it arrived carrying bolt cutters and removed the lock under the supervision of county officials. I recognized him immediately. He avoided eye contact, carefully placed the chain into an evidence bag after photographing it one final time, then stepped aside without saying a word. As the gate swung open for the first time in days, the familiar crunch of my truck rolling across the gravel sounded strangely satisfying. Delivery trucks returned before sunset. Workers came back the following morning. Wedding reservations that had been placed on hold began calling again after receiving confirmation that the vineyard remained fully operational. Within the week, the Homeowners Association formally withdrew every notice, every assessment, and every claimed violation related to my property. Their attorney sent written confirmation acknowledging that my parcel had never been subject to the association's governing documents. Standing near the entrance that evening, I looked at the old oak sign bearing my family name while warm golden light stretched across the vineyard. The gate stood open exactly as my grandfather had always left it. The same entrance that someone once believed could be controlled with a borrowed chain had quietly become the place where recorded history, certified maps, and patient documentation reminded everyone that real authority never begins with confidence. It begins with knowing exactly where your line ends. Harvest season arrived exactly on schedule, just as it had every year since my grandfather planted the first vines on this hillside. The early morning air carried the familiar fragrance of ripe grapes, fresh earth, and oak barrels waiting inside the winery. Sunlight stretched across the vineyard, turning every row into ribbons of gold, and for the first time in weeks there was nothing hanging from my gate except the old wooden sign bearing my family name. No chains, no orange notices, no clipboards, only an open entrance welcoming the trucks that rolled in with the steady crunch of tires over gravel that sounded more satisfying than I could remember. My workers laughed as they filled harvest bins, and conversations that had once revolved around rumors and legal letters returned to weather forecasts and sugar levels in the fruit. Business partners who had hesitated during the uncertainty came back without hesitation, and every scheduled event we had postponed found a new date on the calendar. A few weeks later, my attorney called with the final update. The Homeowners Association's insurance carrier had agreed to resolve the financial losses caused by the disruption to my business, avoiding a much longer legal fight that would have exposed even more documentation. The board also adopted new policies requiring independent legal verification before taking any action involving neighboring properties outside the subdivision. Linda Harper quietly stepped away from her position not long afterward. There was no dramatic announcement and no public speech. Her name simply disappeared from the association newsletter, replaced by someone else promising transparency and better governance. I never celebrated her departure because that had never been my goal. My goal had been much simpler. I wanted my family vineyard left alone. One afternoon, I found myself standing beside the same gate where this entire story had begun. I rested one hand on the weathered oak post and looked toward the distant entrance of Silver Creek Estates. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always had. Children rode bicycles along quiet streets. Sprinklers hissed across carefully trimmed lawns. Life continued. The difference was invisible to almost everyone except me. Somewhere inside a county archive, certified maps and official records had quietly done what arguments never could. They reminded everyone that facts do not become less true simply because someone speaks with confidence. Before heading back to work, I reached into my truck and opened the folder that had traveled with me through every step of the ordeal. Inside were photographs of the chain, copies of every notice, certified survey maps, and the deputy's report. I closed the folder without removing a single page and placed it back behind the seat. I hoped I would never need it again, but I knew exactly why I would keep it. My grandfather used to tell me that vineyards teach patience better than any classroom because the strongest roots spend years growing where nobody can see them. Standing there with another successful harvest beginning around me, I finally understood what he meant. Justice rarely arrives with flashing lights or dramatic speeches. Most of the time it arrives one document at a time, one careful decision at a time, and one undeniable fact at a time until the truth becomes impossible to ignore. They believed a badge, a printed notice, and a borrowed chain could change the boundary of my family's land. In the end, the oldest thing on that hillside turned out to be the strongest. It was not the vineyard. It was the truth recorded on paper long before any of them ever imagined they could rewrite it.